Happy to have Mario Santoyo with us here this week. Mario, always good to have you here, sir.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
The Executive Director of the San Joaquin Valley Water Infrastructure Authority. I always love saying it. It's a mouthful, but I'm getting better at it each time.
I know what you're saying.
So the WIN Act extension, this has been talked about. Jerry Brown has now thrown his support behind this project. I remember this act 2 years ago in 2016. It was highly politically controversial then, with Barbara Boxer going against Dianne Feinstein at the time. Basically, it was Boxer's bill. She ended up pulling out and saying it was a poison pill. And now here we are 2 years later talking about extending it. And not just years-wise, but also enhancing some of these provisions.
That is correct. That's exactly right. The 2016 legislation is going to expire in 2021. But it had a lot of very good provisions who have, over these past 2 years, proven themselves to be beneficial, particularly for here in the Valley. And so between the Senator and Kevin McCarthy, they realized the importance of keeping these values going forward, and have put a legislative package that would extend it to 2028.
So an extra 7 years.
Correct.
And not just that, but when we talk about the amount of money that could potentially go into say water infrastructure, water storage above and below ground, that money now would get extended as well. It's not just an extension of time; it's a boost in the actual.
And that's absolutely correct, because the 2016 legislation had like $335 million for storage in general.
Is that for California? Is that for everybody?
Well, it's a
federal bill.
It's a federal national bill. So there's other competitors involved, but the majority of water projects are usually happen in the West. Okay. So what this new piece of legislation does, it adds $670 million to the pot. So now we're close to having $1 billion overall. Now, of course, that's for both above and below storage. And so, for instance, you have 3 projects above ground. That would be Temperance, there would be Shasta, and there would be San Luis Reservoir that could benefit from it. But on the below ground, the one immediate project that could benefit from it is the rehab work that needs to be done on the Frank Kern Canal, which was impacted by subsidence.
And as we were just talking about before we started talking, Prop 3 in this most recent, that would have put in a lot of money in towards fixing that, but of course that did not pass.
And I think that the Bryant Division people were banking on Prop 3 very heavily, because there was like $750 million there that could really resolve the issue. That hasn't passed, so now they have to step back and figure out how do we get enough funding to move forward with that. And so the WIN Act provides another step forward for funding. All right,
so we have water storage above and below ground, as well as some help to the Frank Kern Canal. This also talks about pumping as well. In fact, it would enhance some of the allowances that has already started from the WIN Act, right?
Absolutely correct. Basically, the WIN Act allows and really instructs for the operators, both at the state and federal level, to be operating the pumps at the higher operating ranges rather than the more conservative lower ranges. And over these past 2 years, that's exactly what has happened, which translates into more flow south of the Delta to the Valley and Southern California. Now, what this new bill does, it adds an additional element to it, which basically authorizes these operators to actually go beyond the upper limits during high runoff periods into the Delta. What that translates into is that a greater opportunity to move water into storage south of the Delta to create a greater water supply.
When we talk about high runoff periods, is this kind of when we hear a lot of people, a lot of politicians talking about water just running out to the ocean? Is that what we're talking about? Basically, when there's been so much runoff up in the mountains, a lot of snow melt coming down, that where we see like Millerton Lake, where they have to release the water. And of course, we're talking farther up in the state. But that's when you're saying that they would allow those pumps to pump more?
That is correct. In the case of the Delta, you have basically Shasta and Oroville that produce the greatest volume of water into the Delta. So when they have to be making all these huge releases, typically they've had to shoot it out to the ocean, because typically there's been restrictions at the pumps. What this legislation does is says, okay, no, you can increase it beyond even what the operating permits allow you to do in order to optimize what you can move into storage.
Now, people who are environmentally sensitive here, environmentalist concerns, the concern always has been, what are these pumps doing to the fish? You know, they'll tell you that they'll chop them up because they will. They'll suck them in if they get too close. But in this new WIN Act extension, I understand that there is some funding there for increased sensors so they could actually detect if there are fish near the pumps.
And that's absolutely correct, Evan. Basically, there'll be funding to increase the number of monitoring stations to determine where the smelt and the salmon are in proximity to the pumps. So bottom line is if there is no fish being sensed in the area, well, it allows the pumps to run. Where right now, that's not typically the case. There's a lot of guesswork that's done, and usually that means lower pumping.
How does this fit in, though, to what we're seeing from the State Water Board, where they're talking about taking water out of the northern San Joaquin tributaries and moving them farther up the state? Because that's been something that hasn't been voted on yet, but I think that might be coming. Well, so how do these things work together? Because we're talking about pulling water down, now going water up, and Jerry Brown, of course, he's supporting this. That has to have something to do with both, right?
Oh, absolutely. Everything has to do with basically the condition of the fish in the delta, and that's the reason the State Resources Control Board is asking for more water flow from the tributaries in the lower portion of the San Joaquin River. And obviously it has the same effect in terms of how much the pumping occurs there. So what's happening is that the WIN Act is going to provide funding for habitat restoration in the delta, and by doing so, theoretically, you're improving the populations of the fish.
How so? How does that improve the populations?
Well, fish depend on food.
So if you improve the habitat, then there'll be more things for the fish to eat.
Where the better living conditions, more food for them to eat, you know, that'll increase populations. And by doing so, that relieves the pressure of more water coming in from the tributaries.
There are critics to this. I was just looking at this from this past week. Editorial from the Mercury News saying Brown Feinstein betrayal of the Delta is unacceptable. Basically saying that we are taking our state water resources and we are handing them over to federal control by doing this, and that the governor is complicit in doing this.
Well, all I can tell you is that in particular, that paper has a very definitive position on a lot of these water issues, and generally speaking, they're not necessarily accurate in the way they're portraying the situation, because as we know, Governor Brown does not support anything too easily. He's got to be convinced it makes sense, okay? And the fact that he also is very close with the environmental community, so he's not about to take a position that would hurt the environment unless he felt that this, whatever was going to be done, actually helped California.
Last question then, because all this is in flux, obviously, but what are we hearing from the next governor of California, Gavin Newsom? Does he have the same sort of support that the governor has?
Well, he'll be challenged because, you know, Jerry's leaving the office, and so he's less concerned about re-election than the new governor. And the new governor, I think, will have the challenge of the environmental community putting the pressure on him to support it less, but I think that once the Newsom comes in and he sees that this project and the legislation makes sense, particularly since it's supported in a bipartisan way. I got to tell you, to get anything to happen in a bipartisan way in Washington, D.C. is not an easy thing.
Yeah, I don't know if that even exists anymore, but apparently it does in this place with Kevin McCarthy, Dianne Feinstein. We need to leave it there, Mario, but thanks so much for taking the time and walking us through it here a little bit.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.